Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you here. We are excited to have you all join us for this next session in the Intermodal Adapt series. This is our new series for 2021. I think the name stands for itself. Intermodal is an incredibly adaptive transportation format. And we've got a great opportunity today with some terrific insights from our friends at TTX. For this edition of Inside the Numbers, today we are going to be taking a 2020 year in review, take stock of how 2020 ended up, and then also take a look at 21 and see where we think it might be going. Our Platinum sponsors have made this session available, and we really appreciate it. So a big thanks to all of them. It goes a long way in helping us bring you quality content, and this session is no example. So thank you to all of our Platinum sponsors. With that, I will just give you a quick overview of what we're going to be touching on today. We're going to take a look at the sort of economic conditions, the prevailing conditions that we are dealing with. Take a look at the 2020 IANA numbers to review how the year finished out. Take a look at international and domestic intermodal, and then dive into questions. So with that, I am pleased to introduce my expert panel. Joining us today from TTX, we have John Woodcock, who is a Director of Market Development, Mr. Pat Casey, who is a consultant with TTX, and Peter Wolf, who is also a Director of Market Development at TTX. Great experts. We've come to rely on their expertise to help guide us, particularly in these rather challenging times. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleagues, and I will join you on the other end for Q&A. Gentlemen, over to you.
Peter, you can go to the first slide there. So we have this back to normal index that Moody's and CNN have put together. It is a lot of weekly and daily data that it shows on there. And part of that is weekly data for intermodal volume on the railroads. So you see that really plunged in the spring, turned back up slowly over the summer, pretty flat in the fall and winter. And, a little surprised it didn't go down when the weather was so bad. So the next slide, that shows you what the normal GDP is, usually between 2 and 4%. During most quarters, consumption is the biggest part of the increase. That's no surprise. Although net exports was the big part in the end of 2019, and that's when the tariffs were in place and pulled imports down. So we'll see where all of that goes. But if we go to the next slide, you see during 2020, tremendous drop, a tremendous surge. That was a seasonally adjusted annual rate. That crashed in the second quarter of 2020 by 31.4%, the biggest we've ever seen. Rebounded 33.4% in the third quarter, and then back to more normal growth in the fourth quarter. The main crash was in consumption and mainly in service during that period of time. And we are still well below the fourth quarter of 2019, and likely that will not go back above that until the second half of this year, or maybe in early 2022. The next slide shows the spending in durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. So you see durable goods went down a little bit and then really spiked recently and expected to continue to go up through the first half of this year. The non-durable goods was pretty normal, although that should go up also in the second half. But then services really plunged in last year and are expected in the second half, when COVID-19 is really done and pushed away, that would surge back up. And this is people going back to restaurants, back to movies, back to concerts, back to games, all kinds of things like that would be part of it. Hopefully that means that the vaccines are done and that people can go back to more normal things. The next slide is industrial production. We expect that growth to be strong, but utilization is still well below 80% at the year end. And also, even with that turn back up, it will still be a little bit below where it was in 2018 and 2019. So be interesting to see, certainly for a lot of intermodal. That's part of it is industrial production. Another question is, will manufacturing come back to the U.S.? As many may know, prior to COVID-19, there was an effort to bring back a lot of manufacturing, but it didn't happen in the past. You just couldn't hire enough people to do it. But with high unemployment much higher than it was, would that happen? We'll see after that. Or will people go back to work at services and rather than going to a factory? You see, e-commerce spiked amidst the pandemic and continues to rise. It had trended up prior to COVID-19, slowly trending up, but really surged up in this time. And that too has really pushed up intermodal volume. E-commerce has been a very big part of that. So we'll see where that goes over time. Will that continue to trend up after COVID-19? We'll have to see where that goes. Will people really want to go back to a store? Or now that they've started to buy things online at home, will they rather just keep on doing that? And interesting that it was doing down a little bit in the fourth quarter, but really surged back up again in January of this year. So the next slide is unemployment, where that rate went up quite a bit to about 15%, went down to about 6%, and still that is quite higher than it was prior to COVID-19. We'll see where that goes. We also show U6 unemployment, which also includes, which regular unemployment doesn't show, discouraged workers who are not seeking jobs, who lost their jobs, and also part-time workers who are seeking full-time jobs. And that went up over 20%, and it's still over 10% right now. So be very interesting to see where employment goes post-COVID-19 and where people are working, and also see, of course, what people get from the government to help them before that. So last slide in the economics shows the forecasting of many things, and you see consumer spending, US GDP turning back up, retail sales expected to go way back up this year. Investment, no, not up much, but that could happen. Housing starts are similar to 2020. Vehicle production is expected to go back up to normal, though sales still a little bit below where it was in 18 and 19. And also we show the forecast for Canada and Mexico that are part of IANA. And those are not going nearly back up as much relative to 2020 as it did in the US. And that's not blaming those things, but those two countries are much more dependent in their GDP on two things. One is trade, and the other is production of oil. Both are a much bigger share of their GDP than they are in the US. So that's a little bit harder to get back up, and we'll see where that goes. So those are the slides we have on the economy, and we will have questions after the rest of the presentation is done. Thank you.
And I typically do on these webinars, we run through a few slides, normal levels. Hal's just sending me a note saying that my audio isn't working so well. So let me see if this works a little better. Hal, send me another note if it's not clear. Thanks. And then if you look on the left side of the screen, you see that US and Canada had about the same growth rate for intermodal overall, both 1 and 2% down. Mexico was down a bit more severely, but again, it's the same economic factors going on. I think what separates the Mexican market from the US and Canada is that there's a really large percentage of the trans-border trade with Mexico that's dedicated to automotive traffic, particularly auto parts, right? And that just cratered in the late second quarter when the auto production virtually went to zero in North America.
Okay, so this is slide 18. So this is another view of the year's results, and we're looking at volume here. And while you see a decline at the top line of trailer, this is actually a significant upside surprise, and that was driven by the strength in the consumer goods markets as well as the e-commerce markets after we started coming out of COVID in May. We were expecting at the beginning of 2020, pre-COVID, we were actually expecting the trailer markets to decline by about 17%. But that the market pandemonium, if you will, and the exponential growth in e-commerce drove that unexpected increase in the trailer demand, excuse me. For the fourth quarter, for these numbers, the year-over-year comparisons were much more robust. Overall, volume was up 9.6% for the quarter. Again, on a year-over-year basis. IPI traffic shook off its earlier losses and gained about 9.4%. Domestic container rose about 10%, and that was particularly strong on the rail equipment side, which was up 12% year-over-year. And then finally, trailer for the quarter was up 17%. On regional loadings, go ahead, Peter.
I'm sorry, John. So for the regional loadings, again, all the regions did about the same. You could more or less say everybody sort of broke even for the year. Certainly April, May, and June, there were some deep losses. And then July and August, you sort of saw the beginnings of recovery, or at least less loss. And then as John just mentioned, September through the end of the year, you saw some pretty strong volumes driven by demand for consumer durable goods and then the slowly recovering industrial sector. Again, the one outlier here is really intermodal in Mexico, again, related to auto part shipment down so much in April and May and June. And of course, as John mentioned, there's lots of growth in the parcel segment driven by e-commerce sales. But that is not a particularly large segment of the transborder US-Mexico market. So again, that explains a little bit why intermodal in Mexico was down. Now, John, I'll turn it back over to you for the next two slides.
Yeah, and Peter, I just wanted to make one comment. If you go back to that slide, the one, thank you. Yeah, the one market that we see a big gain in the U.S. was in Mountain Central, and so 6.6% for the year. And in the fourth quarter, it was actually up a whopping 27%. And we believe that the IANA data proves that out. It's a domestic market primarily, and that's where the outsized growth is in the Mountain Central. And we believe that this is probably a factor related to the greater footprint that Salt Lake City and Denver have in the development of regional e-commerce distribution and fulfillment hubs for the rest of the Rockies. So it's a small market, relatively speaking, but it seems to be growing at an outsized pace. The right thing. The northwest to southwest, for instance, the corridors, these are bidirectional corridors. They're not northwest to southwest. It's between the northwest and the southwest. But looking at the top growth gains in the larger corridors, given the anomalous activity brought on by COVID, it's really difficult to draw any significant conclusions from a lot of the performance here. An example, for instance, is between the northwest and southwest. We looked at the data, and the growth was primarily on a southbound basis from northwest to southwest. And we believe this is probably demand that was the result of displaced inventory repositioning. Possibly it came in as import material over the Port of Seattle or Portland and then moved back down for redistribution into LA. So if personal anecdotes count for anything, I actually recently received a small kitchen appliance that was routed from an import distribution center in LA, and it went from LA up to Portland using a parcel carrier. And then from Portland, it went by air from Portland to Louisville, and then it was trucked to Metro Chicago distribution center before coming to my home in the city. So obviously, supply chains are disjointed right now, and so it's really difficult to come to any conclusions on what a lot of this growth and decline means. Really quickly touching on some of the underperforming lanes here. Again, we can't draw too many conclusions, but looking at the top two, we believe the intra-northeast and the intra-northwest were probably affected by a lack of export movements on the international side, as well as intra-regional IPI moves that we have in the northwest. Possibly on the northwest too, based on some of the numbers, there could have been slightly less municipal solid waste movements, which is a big part of the intra-northwest moves coming out of Seattle, going into the hinterland for landfill. Back to you, Peter.
And so now we'll talk about international intermodal for the next few slides. And we'll start with ports, typically where international intermodal always starts. So for last year, North American imports declined 1.9%. And for those of you keeping score, I'll read off the US, Canada, and Mexico figures. I'll give you a second to grab a pencil and paper if you want. For this year, we're looking at a forecast of about 8.9%. So what was lost in 2020, we expect to see a comeback pretty much all the way this year. So last year, US imports gained 3.3%. Imports to Canada were literally flat with 0% growth. And Mexico imports declined 10.7%. That was for 2020. TTX's forecast for 2021 is US imports are expected to grow 10.6%. Canada is expected to grow 4.8%. And Mexico may still be down. Right now, we're not sure, but maybe in the 1 to 2% range. We'll have to see. And all this is assuming that the stimulus is passed, that the Decent Recovery Act is forget the exact name for it, but the relief payments are made, which helps the economy during the time of the COVID shutdown, and also that we reach herd immunity by, say, the third or fourth quarter of this year, allowing the economy to reopen. I think Pat touched on all of that. Last January, so January of 2020, imports were down about 2%. But things really didn't go south for the year. Really, it's more February and March. And that's when manufacturing in Asia shut down in response to COVID. And then I think many people remember April and May. Of course, many people really want to forget, but in April and May, the combination of supply shocks in Asia, along with demand shocks in North America, as the US, Canada, and Mexico went into lockdown, pushed down imports roughly 20-25%. Imports remained negative in June and July, but in August, they were positive for the first time. And then by October, they were growing at a 20% rate compared to the same period in 2019. Again, driven mainly by demand in consumer durable goods. For full year, the North American imports were pretty close to break even, down 1.9%. But I think you've heard me say this before. It was like having 1 foot in boiling water and 1 foot in ice water. For the first 6 months of the year, your foot was in ice water. And the last 6 months of the year, things were, maybe I don't say red hot, but imports had really improved come August or so. And then last month, it looks like the only data we have so far is for the US. Imports were up about 10.4%. You forgive me, I've shown this slide before, but tariffs are still in effect. So I think the slide is still relevant to show again. And the way to read the slide, if you look at the blue bar on the far right, that represents 250 billion of industrial goods imported from China into the US that are under a 25% tariff. And then the peach colored bar on top of that, that reflects another $111 billion of consumer goods that are tariffed at a 7.5% rate. So the total amount of imports from China that are under tariff are about 360 billion, roughly 2/3 of the total imports from China. And then the bars to the left just reflect the recent history of how the scope, meaning the amount of goods under tariff, and the tariff rates, how they changed from 2008 climbing to 2019, and then ultimately reaching what I just talked about in 2020 of 250 billion at a 25% tariff, and another $111 billion at a 7.5% tariff. And at this particular moment, I think President Biden has announced that there'd be no immediate plans to change the tariffs, which is why I wanted to bring up the slide. They're still in effect. And so the question is, what does that mean? And the short answer is, I'm not really sure. But let me walk you through some data and help you point out some things, and you can reach your own conclusions. But the chart on the left shows the volume change from importing region or countries last year. And you can see that the blue bar on the far left shows that imports from China increased by about 173,000 TEUs, which was about a 2-3% increase over 2019. And in contrast, in 2019, imports from China declined over 10%. And then the chart on the right shows that China's share of US imports. And by the third and fourth quarter of 2020, China's share was back to the pre-tariff levels of the first quarter of 2018, roughly 44-45%. And so my interpretation of all the data is that in 2019, when the world was normal, a lot of companies went out of their way to change their supply chains to avoid the tariffs. And so imports from China sank 10%. And I had some meetings very early in the year of 2020 with companies that were continuing to try and change their supply chains, move away from China. And it was just starting, the impact of COVID was just starting to become apparent, but it was still, at least in this one shipper's mind, they wanted to get out of China to avoid tariffs. But as 2020 came to pass, it's really hard to change supply chains in the middle of a pandemic, right? For two reasons. You can't get on a plane, you can't go visit a new factory, you can't set up a new contract, you can't get a test run of new goods. So nobody can really have that ability to change. And then the market was different, right? So the first part of the year, things were really weak. Second part of the year, things were really hot. You didn't want to disrupt your supply chain. You wanted to get the goods to market as quick as you can. So there was very little incentive to change the supply chain. So nobody did in 2020. So the question is, what's 21 going to bring? Is it going to look like 2019? Or is it going to look like 2020, where people won't be able to change supply chains? I think as long as the tariffs are in effect, it's probably going to lead people to change supply chains and move product away from China. But as long as demand is really robust and the world is locked down and still can't travel, it may be impossible to do that. And why this is important is that if production shifts away from China to Eastern Europe or to South Asia, which might be Bangladesh or India, those goods have a very high propensity to land on the East Coast. And if an import lands on the East Coast, there may be a 20-25% chance it moves inland by rail. But for production that originates in China or other countries in East Asia, such as Vietnam, 60-70% of those goods land on the West Coast. And of the goods that land on the West Coast, there's a 60-80% chance, depending on what port it comes in at, that it will move inland by rail. So as production migrates away from China, it could have a far higher likelihood of landing on the East Coast and then have a much less likely chance of moving inland by rail. For the next two slides I want to talk about are the trends that follow all water share and transload. And so all water share, as TTX defines it, is the share of imports from China and other nearby countries in East Asia that discharge on the East Coast rather than the West Coast. And as I just talked about, from an intermodal standpoint, goods that lands on the East Coast have a 20-25% chance of moving inland by rail, and then goods that land on the West Coast have a 70-80% chance of moving inland by rail. And over the past 2 decades, all water share has gained about 0.8 of a share point per year. But in 2020, all water share reversed and actually declined about 0.8 of a share point. And that's what the blue bar indicates. That it's hard to see a little bit of a dip for 2020, but it's actually a bit less than it was in 2019. On the other hand, the peach bar represents volume, and all water volume actually grew in 2020. In 2020, there were about 5.9 million TEUs that routed all water. In 2019, it was about 5.7 million TEUs. And for 2021, TTX forecasts all water share reaching about 38.6%, with volume in the neighborhood of about 6.4 million TEUs. So why did all water share reverse in 2020? And the short answer is, I really don't know. I think I'm not convinced it was by design. I think it was just all the turmoil and the disruption in the supply chains simply caused all water share to change a bit throughout the year. And that's why I put the blue and yellow box on the bottom, and you can see how all water share fluctuated month to month in 2020 versus 2019. But I think the important thing on the slide is if you look on the blue bar where you see September, October, November, December, all water share was tracking pretty much at a historical rate. In the fourth quarter of 2020, it was at 38.7 versus 38.8 for the full year. So as I talked about earlier, where in the fourth quarter, John mentioned there was freight was really coming on strong. Things were sort of getting a little bit back to normal. As the freight normalized, so did all water share. So I don't think there's any design by the shippers to change all water share right now. What's in the news a lot is a lot of demand, a lot of freight volume coming into the West Coast. But there's also a lot of freight volume coming into the East Coast. I don't think shippers are preferring to bring freight over any coast. I think we're back to our typical all water share of close to 40% on the East Coast and 60% for the West Coast. And then the next slide, I want to talk about the next trend we've talked about before is transloading. Because TTX defines transloading as the share of imports that'll discharge on the West Coast and then move into a 53-foot container and route inland in a 53-foot container rather than move intact. And I think the same thing is true all water share as a transload, that it's relatively stable. There were certainly some fluctuations month to month within 2020. But when you look at the year as a whole, particularly if you look at the Pacific Southwest, 2020 all transload share was 35.6%, very similar to 2019's of 34.7. And the transload volume and share for Western Canada, again, very consistent share, steady volume growth. A little bit different story in the PNW, but perhaps for a little bit different reason. So in the Pacific Northwest, you can see that transload share spiked in 2020 to 37.1%, but volume growth to about 470,000 TEUs from 450 was about a 5 to 6% growth. That rate of growth is very similar to what you see in the PSW and in Western Canada for 2020. But the difference was there were a lot of auto parts that would come in through the PNW, and as auto part volume declined, as auto production shut down, then the denominator shrank of the equation that creates the transload number. And so it wasn't that transload was spiking, it was volume of imports, particularly auto parts, dropped, and that caused the transload share to spike. But for 2021, our view is that transloading will get back to its normal share in all the markets with a reasonable amount of growth commensurate with imports coming into the region. And then the last slide I want to show and talk about, before I turn it over to John and talk about domestic, simply the IPI growth rate for last year and then the forecast for this year. And so last year, US in the East, IPI declined about 4%. In the West, it declined about 8%. Canada fell close to 2%. And Mexico dipped 22%. Our forecast for this year is that the US East will grow about 9.6%. US West expected to grow about 5.5%. Canada should grow about 6.2%. Mexico should be flat, maybe down a point, maybe up a point. Total growth for 2021 should be in the neighborhood of about 7.3%. And again, the same caveats, right? That government stimulus relief payments are passed in a timely manner, and that COVID is controlled and herd immunity reached by a third or fourth quarter. And so what happened in Mexico? And I think part of it is that Pat talked about the Mexican economy, more energy dependent, oil production, that was hit hard. But in terms of international intermodal, they had, besides a weak domestic economy, then weak exports to their two largest trading partners, US and Canada, there had some disruptions through political protests that were blocking some of the tracks from the ports. And since the ports are relatively close to the urban areas, when protests occurred, that traffic could simply be trucked to market as opposed to rail. and hard for us to forecast if there are going to be continuing protests or not. But assuming the protests go away, IPI should return to normal levels in Mexico in relatively short order. So that's the international intermodal story. And like I say, for this year, the bottom line is we would expect that all of 2020 losses should be recovered in 2021. So with that, I'll turn it over to John, and he can talk about domestic intermodal.
Thanks, Peter. So let's quick look at the current market. The year began with a continuation of the robust demand that we experienced in the back half of 2020. For those of you who don't subscribe to Cass and get their monthly report, for January, they reported an 8.6% year-over-year increase in their shipments index. And interestingly, that actually corresponds pretty closely with IANA's numbers for January. Domestic container increased 8.5% in the US in January and about 6.9% in Canada, while TOFC was up 14.7%, albeit against some pretty easy comps. TOFC was down, I think, in the mid-20s in the beginning of 2020, prior to COVID. So strong consumer spending, solid housing starts, and the strengthening industrial production are all driving demand. And further, as we all know, COVID-related supply chain and labor disruptions have not been cleared up yet. And that's leading to a widely dispersed demand backlog. And while businesses appear to be pushing the capacity of the intermodal network, it's interesting to point out that the January domestic volume numbers that I just quoted, they're only up about 6% above 2018 levels. So not a dramatic increase above 2018 levels, though that was a previous high watermark. Tight conditions are being magnified by really the shortcomings on the supply side of the industry. On the truckload side, we'll focus on there. If you look at the graph on the left, that's the Morgan Stanley Truckload Freight Index for dry van. And what this illustrates is that the trucking market's supply and demand balance, which is the red line for 2020, it's showing that there are some pretty substantially tight conditions that are well above normal, especially for this time of year. They started easing a little bit in late January into early February, and then most likely weather-related, it started spiking back up. So very, very tight conditions on the trucking side. As we stated in the last presentation that we had back in the fourth quarter, we believe that driver capacity really remains, quote, the issue. Restrictions on driver training have reduced new driver entrants by as much as 40%, while the FMCSA drug clearinghouse has sidelined close to 50,000 drivers. About 4,000 drivers are being prohibited from service on a monthly basis, a monthly rate. And only a fraction of that, maybe 25% of that number, those drivers are actually applying for, through the restitution, if you will, to come back into the driver pool. That's really had a negative downward effect on driver supply. And of course, COVID has prompted some drivers to retire or forced some to quarantine, and that continues to this day. And at the same time, you have the labor needs of a very strong housing market, which is also driving away, no pun intended, is driving away some drivers from the trucking industry back into the housing market as laborers, carpenters, electricians, et cetera. More than one intermodal company has related that these days are among the worst recruiting conditions ever experienced. And it's much more concerning given that we still have relatively high unemployment, as Pat was referring to earlier. So looking ahead for the remainder of the year, look at the graph on the right. That's FTR Associates' freight outlook for dry van. And we think it's a reasonable look ahead. The bars indicate year-over-year changes, while the line that you see, the light blue line, represents the FTR dry van loadings index. Year-over-year comparisons will start to normalize beginning in the third quarter. And then in the early fourth quarter of 2020, our crystal balls were sufficiently murky so that we really had not a lot of confidence in what the market conditions were going to be after the first quarter of 2021. We believe that the future is a little more clear now, given the continued demand, the promise of further stimulus in the economy, the fact that we're coming to the back half of the pandemic, as well as the fact that we have a continuing disarray in the demand backlog because of supply chain disruptions. And so we do think that the improved demand conditions and the treading of water we're seeing on the backlog and low inventory levels, we're expecting outsized demand that will continue at least into the latter part of the summer, if not into the fall. So we like to show the North American Class 8 truck orders because we believe it's an accurate proxy for trucking industry health as well as confidence in future market conditions. So the trucking companies buy tractors in times of healthy profitability, and they also use the tractors, new tractors, in part as a recruiting tool to attract new drivers. If you look at the far right of the graph, you'll see the spiking demand. And November and December saw the two highest monthly order volumes in recent times, if not all. I don't have data going back more than 20 years or so. But OEMs are reporting that they're facing the same challenge as so many other industries, which is component supply shortages, as we were talking about earlier with regard to disjointed supply chains. From sheet steel to microchips, the trucking OEMs are really having a difficult time in facing the order boom that they have before them. They are also having some significant issues with regard to gaining and retaining qualified labor. And so this is, I really think this is just an example of what we're seeing across industries and across geographic regions throughout the country and throughout North America. Interestingly, ACT Research is actually tempering their build forecast. They've increased it a few times in the last few months, but they're tempering their build forecast for the full year, which is now at 302,000 units. And that's given the supply conditions and not the demand conditions. So they recognize that supply is really going to be the gating item here in trying to satisfy industry demand. And of course, once those tractors come out on the market, then we still have the challenge of getting those tractors seated. So looking to capacity growth on the intermodal realm, we talked to you back in the fourth quarter, we would have had much more muted expectations regarding domestic container builds. Many of the folks we talked to back in October and November were really taking a wait and see attitude. And we initially expected fleet growth for 2021 to actually be less than 1%. I believe it was about 0.8% that we were forecasting. But the continued solid performance in the market has prompted quite a few equipment owners to take a new look and increase their positions in 2021. While we've not talked with all the major box owners, or either not all of the minor box owners as well, there's more and more popping up. It's getting a little more difficult to track this market, considering the number of owners that are establishing themselves in the market. We're expecting a build of near 25,000 units in 2021, and that's net of retirements. Older boxes may not all work their way to the scrapyard. It's possible that some will be held in ready reserve with current owners, or they'll be sold on the secondary market, which has happened with a few fleets. And those are being held for peak demand periods and leased out on a per trip or per month basis, short-term agreements. So by the end of the year, we're forecasting the combined U.S. and Canadian private box fleet to approach about 240,000 units. And the railroad fleet will stay steady at about 115,000 dry boxes. In addition, we're expecting growth in the reefer container fleet to expand to nearly 12,000 units. So all told, about 6.9 to 7% growth in the container fleet for 2021, and that is probably on the conservative side. Okay, so the container build somewhat matches our domestic container volume forecast. After what we all consider a remarkable back half of 2020, we're still expecting further growth in 2021, and we've recently upped our forecast to consider 5.9% growth for the year. Of course, the year-over-year comps will moderate quite a bit in the second half versus what we'll be seeing over the next several months. On the TOFC side, again, I was mentioning this earlier, TOFC in 2020, it was a huge upset to the positive for the trailer market. Yeah, COVID and e-commerce really proved us wrong. And in 2021, as I mentioned a bit earlier with regard to the year-over-year numbers, trailer again is off to a strong start in 2021. But we feel that as supply chains normalize and inventories, or particularly e-commerce inventories, are increasingly forward placed into the hinterland as opposed off of coasts, we think that TOFC volume will be affected negatively, and that conversions will also continue as well, going from as we say, T2C, from trailer to container. The reefer fleet that I mentioned in the last 2 slides ago, the reefer fleet's continuing to be augmented to make possible further trailer to container conversions. The timing of all of this between T2C conversions as well as changes in e-commerce logistics, it's a bit unpredictable, and the market may not settle down as quickly as we expect, even in 2021. As you see here, we're expecting about 3% decline, but we do expect gradual decline in this market over the longer term. And then finally, the last slide. So if you combine the domestic container as well as the trailer together, we're looking at about 4.7% growth in the intermodal market for 2021.
Again, not a whole lot of mystery of what we're watching. We're watching the same thing that everybody else is, and what we've talked about throughout the webinar today, but what's going to be the path of the virus, the vaccine distribution, its effectiveness, and in the meantime, the government stimulus and aid to the unemployed. On top of that, it's going to be trade policy and tariffs, which can have a big impact on imports, besides the volume, again, what coasts they hit at. And that's going to drive intermodal volumes depending on where the imports land. And then we're also trying to get our arms around what's going to happen with this really strong demand for consumer goods and how that plays into inventory levels. And when we look at the data, we think inventories are probably a bit below their historical norm, and demand is really robust for consumer goods. So between low inventory, strong demand, that implies they're going to be continuing strong durable goods orders, which means more goods coming in, means a lot of freight's going to have to move. So those are things we're watching. John, Pat, anything you'd like to add, particularly on the inventory side, if I hit that correctly?
Just wanted to say, Peter, that you and I have, both been looking at the inventory levels and trying to create models and to determine what part of the demand is, what part of the inventory replenishment or the demand backlog, if you will, is affecting actual current freight levels. And it's a difficult one to explain. At best, we think it's maybe a 2% positive with regard to freight demand levels, but it's something that we're just roughing out right now, and we're working with our economists to see if we can come up with some better models that help us understand how changing inventory levels change freight demand.
Well, and especially for durable goods, inventories could not change, but the inventory to sales ratio could really surge, and we'll see where that goes.
We can turn it back over to Hal and Beth, and if you'd like to start fielding some questions, we'll answer those as best we can.
Tremendous. Gentlemen, thank you very much. That was great. It was a little challenging reliving the last several months over again in the numbers. A lot of good information there and some good questions from the attendees. One of the questions is the continued surprising strength in trailers related, at least in part, to the limited number of domestic containers and the sort of slow growth of the domestic fleet in general?
That's a very good question, but I guess I would counter it by saying there may be an influence, but consider that the trailer market took off in May and June when volumes elsewhere were really, really soft, and railroads as well as bimodal carriers and IMCs had many containers in storage. And so I think it went more to the boom in trailers went more to the service aspect of what trailers represent, which is premium service. And it was focused on that one segment, which was e-commerce parcel LTL that demand the faster service.
Got it. And to clarify, you guys see sort of a carryover in terms of the numbers for trailers in 21?
Yeah, it's a slight decline. We're looking at about 3.5% decline in 2021. And just for information, the market used to be the best we could segment the market from based on the limited information we have. We don't, we work with the railroads and work with participants and kind of cobble together estimates about on the traditional share rate that we would use maybe 5 or 10 years ago was that parcel and LTL was about 50% of the trailer market, and about 30% of the trailer market, 30 to 35% was on the temperature controlled side. And then the remainder was expedited truckload and other. That is the best we can tell. That has since changed, and because of the proliferations, I'll get the word out, proliferation of reefer containers into the market, reefers become a much smaller part of the trailer segment. It's probably down to from 30 to 35%, down to 15 to in the high teens. And at the same time, because of the resurgence of e-commerce and the need for premium services in that area, LTL and parcel has probably upped their share to 65, 70% of the total trailer market.
Got it. And here's a question riffing on that. Just could you restate what the anticipated numbers are going to be for refrigerated containers in 21?
It's about a little over 12,000 units. And that's US and Canada for total reefers. That's not the build, that'll be the total population at the end of 21.
But you're expecting at least a slight increase in the build, right?
Yes, correct.
So here's an interesting question. Can you touch on how intermodal tends to fit into a shipper's e-commerce network?
You want to tackle that one, Peter, or do you want me to?
Sure, I can butcher it, and then you can come in and fix it. But I think we think it's similar to the footprint for brick and mortar stores, in that you'll have distribution into a maybe from a large major DC or a port region, moving into regional or interior DCs, and it can be an intermodal move, whether that's for a store or an e-commerce retailer or a corporation that is both, right? And then from the regional DC to a store, intermodal doesn't play, right? It's a short haul, maybe a 50-mile haul, maybe a 100-mile haul, but it's not really an intermodal rail portion. And the same thing with an e-commerce. If it gets to a location close to a city, then from that DC within the city to people's homes, that's not an intermodal play. As much as, with the train picture behind me, as much as I'd like to have tracks running to everybody's private home, that's not going to happen, right? So from the DC to a store, or from a DC to people's doors, that's not an intermodal play. It's never been an intermodal play. There's very little difference between e-commerce and brick and mortar stores in that sense. It's the feed into the regional DCs that support e-commerce, that support brick and mortar stores. And that's where it's playing. And as e-commerce grows, I think there are, people can hear the doorbell. Speaking of e-commerce, looks like we just got something delivered.
Yes.
So that was perfect timing. And so I think as e-commerce expands, they tend to be large players in e-commerce. They tend to be more sophisticated. And I think that is helping the intermodal marketplace, because they want to use intermodal. They know how to use it. They can take advantage of it. It provides very measurable savings. There also may be something that we're trying to get our arms around, that there are returns, that if you buy something at a store, it may be a 10% chance it returns because you can try it on, versus if it's e-commerce, it's maybe as much as 1/3 of things purchased online may be returned. And that may help spur more intermodal traffic as the returns go back to the DCs.
Yeah, that's great. We're coming up on the hour, but I do have a couple more questions to get to. I'll try to squish them down as much as possible. There's a lot around tariffs, and any insights into the future of tariffs. One question is around any indications on the Biden administration's, at least early statements they've made about keeping the tariffs in place, and is it actually possibly a source of funding to offset the recovery plans that we've got, since domestic consumers are paying those tariffs for the most part, unless it's the importers that are eating part of them. So that's a piece of it. But just sort of any insights on tariffs and how they might play a role as we move into 21 and beyond.
Just what I read in the paper, and I think people can make their own conclusions from that. The fees that are collected from tariffs are about $70 billion a year. The recent proposal, I think that's on the table for the stimulus, is 1.9 billion. So I don't really see tariff fees really offsetting government spending in other areas. It's really meant to try and deter buying product from China and moving it to other parts of the world. As to what Biden does next, I don't know. When I read in the paper, he says tariffs are going to remain in place. What's possible is that you can be granted exemptions to tariffs. There were a number of items that were exempted under the Trump administration. Those exemptions lasted no more than a year, so they've all expired. So it's possible, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's possible a new administration could simply start granting exemptions. And then 6 months, a year from now, book of tariff just looks like a brick of Swiss cheese with a lot of holes in it and a lot of exemptions. So on paper, you can say they're tariffs, and in a practical matter, they're not, because many products have been exempted. But whether that happens, I don't know. As of now, I think there are very few exceptions.
Okay, thanks. And then one last question. I'll try to do injustice to many and make one question out of several. But roughly, in terms of trying to sort out peak season, like, will we ever see a peak season again? And is peak season from 20 being pulled into Q1 of 21? Sort of what's the future of peak season, based, or at least for the foreseeable future, based on kind of where we are and what you can tell, at least thus far?
Well, we're always going to have a peak season. It's kind of like trailers, right? The peak death of the peak season. But I think with this year, you're just going to have some crazy comps. So remember, last May, imports fell 20%. So just to get back to 2019 levels, imports are going to have to grow in May, something in the range of 35, 40%, because if you fall 20, then your recovery is on that down 20. So you almost have to double that. So you're going to go, oh my God, 40% growth in May. Well, now you're just getting back to 2019 levels. And then come October, which can be pretty much the peak of the peak. I think last October may have set an all-time record for imports in containerized imports into North America. Are you going to hit that again this October? Maybe not. But it's like, I would do a lot of baseball analogies. If one year you hit 360 and the next year you're hitting 320, you're still a Hall of Famer. So maybe if things are down just a bit, you're still well above where you normally are for that time of year. It depends how retailers view the holiday season, and it could be a very good holiday season if stimulus works and things recover. So John,
so I'm sorry, Peter, to interrupt. Just a couple emerging trends that we've actually been expecting in some respects that peak is going to flatten a little bit. So instead of a peaky peak, if you will, we're expecting like a more drawn out peak, and a couple reasons for that. One is, well, in this past year, we saw a lot of e-tailers, if you will, the e-commerce folks, actually starting to offer some of their best deals in October. And I think that was in order to secure supply chain availability and not have everybody wait until the last minute, given all the disruptions. And that is something that may actually take off as a trend in future years, where people start purchasing in September, October, and early November, as opposed to much closer to the actual holiday. And then the other aspect or two other aspects that we see that may flatten things out a little bit is is the rise of giving gift cards, where the actual product is not purchased until after Christmas. So Christmas Day or Hanukkah, you get your gift card, and then you go out and do your shopping afterwards. And so your shopping is actually happening in late December, early January. And then the final aspect of that, given the rise of returns, the phenomenon of returns in e-commerce, is that you have an awful lot of returns that enter into the system in January, late January after Christmas. And you're returning the toaster you didn't want, or the pants that were the wrong size. And so that's actually prolonging the demand on the parcel and LTL side somewhat into late January. So it'll be interesting to see how the peak forms or deforms over the coming years.
Well, listen, folks, we've got more questions. I wish we could answer them, but we're up against it. I appreciate everybody's time, especially our colleagues from TTX for helping out doing the analysis, so we don't have to. If folks are interested in kind of digging into the source of a lot of the information that TTX helps us clean and analyze, that's available through us. The ETSO database is the key source of that information that is a lot of the information that these guys referenced throughout the talk. So that's available over at intermodal.org, or you can email us at info@intermodal.org and find more information out about what kind of data offerings we do have, which there's a few over there, but we'll just mention ETSO right now. But I want to again thank our Platinum sponsors, great folks. We really appreciate their help in bringing this session to you. So many thanks to them for their support. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for their time, everybody for their hard work. We appreciate you spending your time with us, and we appreciate you keeping the economy going. Stay safe, and we hope to see you real soon.